Today on our program, we are joined by Shea, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security and Defense at Friends of Europe and former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Welcome to our studio.
Thank you for inviting me back, Sofia. Pleasure to be with you.
Moscow was hit by drone attacks overnight, and Mayor of the city, Sobyanin, saying that more than 30 drones were shot down. Some analysts have suggested before that if residents of Moscow start feeling the war's impact, the war's consequences, it could pressure Putin. What do you make of this attack, and could it actually change the course of the war?
Well, I've said this for many years now. It's good that Ukraine is able to carry the war directly to Russia and to show the Russian population the consequences of what Putin is doing, because, of course, Putin has tried to erect this smokescreen since invading Ukraine, that the war really is having no impact on the Russian economy or Russian life. He's trying to keep the reality of the conflict, particularly all of the hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties away from the Russian civilian population, to main support for what he calls his special military operation. So anything that Ukraine can do to sort of break that illusion, to break through that smokescreen and make it clear that Putin's war has consequences for Ukraine, but also consequences for Russia, I think is a step in the right direction. It also shows, of course, that Ukraine is able now to produce drones en masse, like Russia is doing, and that therefore Ukraine is able to keep up regularly these salvos of drones which are being sent into Russia. However, that said, I think in terms of maintaining Western support, NATO support, and of course a continuing supply of weapons, which is what really matters for Kiev, it's important not to attack civilian targets and cause unnecessary civilian casualties. That, of course, is, I know, what Putin is doing by attacking Ukrainian cities, but I think Ukraine's biggest success has been, sinking ships in the Black Sea, taking out oil refineries, attacking port terminal facilities on the Baltic, like the attack on Ust-Luga the other day, really hitting the Russian war machine, ammunition factories, where it really hurts. For example, those spectacular attacks on Russian air bases, destroying strategic bombers, those kind of things really hit the Russian war effort, and those, I think, are within the parameters of what the West would like to see Ukraine doing, not causing unnecessary civilian casualties by deliberately attacking civilian targets. And I'm glad that so far Ukraine seems to be not doing that, which I think is positive.
Also, in the recent days, Ukrainian drones have been increasingly targeting Russian oil refineries. How effective do you think these strikes are, and do you expect them to ramp up?
So they've been super effective, and it's the oil refineries, it's the supply networks, the storage depots. I mentioned the attack on Ust-Luga, the port terminal for the Russian shadow fleet of tankers on the Baltic, which also, of course, prevents Russia from exporting its oil. And if Russia can't export its oil, Russia can't earn the money to fuel its war effort. So it's been a fairly comprehensive campaign so far. It's been drones, but there's also evidence, for example, in attacking the oil refinery at Volgograd last weekend, that Ukrainian special forces have been used as well. And there are reports that, for example, in Western Russia, the production of petrol, gasoline for cars, for the civilian economy has decreased by about a quarter. Russian drivers are having to queue up to try to get petrol at service stations. So again, this is a way of really bringing home the reality of the conflict to the Russian civilian population. So yes, I think this is really a very good campaign. And I think when President Zelensky is in the United States, he has to say to Trump, look, there have been reports that the Pentagon has been putting restrictions on the use of American-supplied long-range artillery cruise missiles to strike Russian targets. This was already the reality under the Biden administration as well. And look, please lift these restrictions so that we can make flexible use of the long-range systems, the JSOMs, the ATACMS that you are giving us, because again, this is the best way that we can stop the Russian war economy and make it more difficult for the Russians to supply their soldiers in Ukraine itself. So I hope that Trump, particularly with his increasing frustration with Putin for continuing the war, will be more receptive to this message, which I'm sure Zelensky is going to deliver in the United States.
Well, that's a good point. And meanwhile, we have another news about unidentified drones that entered Norwegian and Danish airspace this night. It's still unclear whether they were Russian drones or not. And until now, we saw drone activity that was very limited to countries bordering Ukraine, and we haven't seen such bold incursions into NATO airspace before. What's your take on that?
Well, two things right from the beginning. Number one, not all drones that you find in our European airspace come from Russia. For example, Poland has reported that they've found drones on the ground in Poland, which were domestic drones. So we have to be careful that NATO has a proper system in place for early warning, for tracking, which can really distinguish between the Russian drones, either accidentally or, I think in the case of Poland a couple of days ago, deliberately entering NATO airspace, and other things that could be, done by pranksters or jokers, or you always get these people, of course, in all of our societies. So that's the first point. But yes, it is worrying that we're now seeing a whole series of these incidents, including, of course, the violation of Estonian airspace a couple of days ago by the three Russian MiG-31s, as well as, of course, the Zapad exercise last week in Belarus. All the various aspects of the Russian hybrid warfare campaign. And there is a meeting at NATO headquarters today called by Estonia under Article 4 of the NATO treaty. And I'm sure, one of the things that NATO really needs to do quickly is to, really improve its counter-drone air defense early warning tracking system, particularly in Eastern Europe, as these Russian provocations increase, and also really work out how is it going to respond. Some allies are saying, well, we should shoot down Russian aircraft violating our airspace. Others are more cautious. But I think ambiguity vis-a-vis Russia is the worst thing you can do. So I think NATO needs to find technical solutions. It also needs to be clear about the red lines. But, Sofia, there's a big opportunity for Ukraine here, because Zelensky has offered the collaboration of Ukrainian defense industry, which is much more ahead of NATO when it comes to multi-layered counter-drone defense. The Ukrainians have got a lot of experience, a lot of capabilities, for example, counter-drones in the air. NATO doesn't have this. So I see this also as a golden opportunity to integrate a Ukrainian airspace with NATO airspace in a common air defense system in the future.
From your perspective, Ukraine could join together in some projects with NATO, or with, this project drone walls, which the EU is planning to create?
Absolutely, Sofia. There's a meeting, a virtual meeting today of EU defense ministers on the eastern flank, the ones who, like Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, etc., but also Norway, Denmark, at least Denmark from the EU, that are most affected by this. And Ukraine is being invited to participate in that meeting on the drone wall. So I think that there is this acknowledgement that, we need a much better tracking system. The drones fly across Ukraine or Belarus. I mentioned the technical cooperation that the Ukraine defense industry can provide. And I do think in the wake of Putin's attacks in Western Ukraine, Lvov, and the possibility of the Russian drones and missiles, not just drones, missiles, also crossing into NATO airspace, that there's merit in this idea of a kind of 100-kilometer exclusion zone, which NATO would police across the Ukrainian border so that it could intercept in Ukrainian airspace any drones or missiles which quite clearly were going into NATO airspace as well. So those are the kind of ideas which I think are important. The other thing is that the EU looks set to include Ukraine in its SAFE investment program, 150 billion euros for the security for Europe, the SAFE program, which will allow Ukrainian companies and EU companies, defense companies to work together on investments, on sharing technology, more EU investments in Ukrainian defense industry, which is functioning below capacity. So that's also, I think, a very positive step forward.
You mentioned this idea of patrol in some areas in the western part of Ukraine. Could this idea be seen as an escalation by Putin?
Well, the problem, Sofia, is that when NATO does nothing, Putin escalates. I mean, NATO has not put any troops in Ukraine. That, of course, has being discussed by European countries as a reassurance force after a ceasefire and peace agreement. But although NATO shows a tremendous restraint, Ukraine is not joining NATO in the near future. Whatever our personal thoughts on that topic, but that doesn't stop Putin escalating. Putin attacks dams in Norway, blocks GPS signals for European civilian aviation, cuts pipelines and cables in the Baltic Sea. So, Putin escalates where NATO doesn't escalate. So I think to some degree, to my mind, this is a bit of a false argument. And I think the one thing that will de-escalate the situation is determined action by NATO, and NATO establishing clear rules and clear red lines for deterrence. Because as long as NATO does nothing or is divided or doesn't respond, then I think Putin is going to see NATO as weak, and the provocations are not going to stop. The provocations are going to continue. If there's one lesson we've learned from the war in Ukraine over the last 3 years, it's that one. If you're weak, Putin will challenge you.
Talking about the violation of NATO airspace by Russia, Czech President Petr Pavel recently said that Russian planes should be shot down if they enter NATO airspace after this developments and incidents in Estonia. Do you agree with this statement?
I think NATO has to discuss this and establish red lines. I mean, obviously, Sofia, there's a clear difference between an aircraft which is deliberately violating your airspace, 12 minutes, can't be an accident, not just, crossing the border for 15 seconds, and therefore is a provocation. And of course, every NATO country has the responsibility to defend its territory and its airspace. So that is one case. The other case is that you get which we also had last week, some Russian jets flying over an energy platform in the Baltic Sea. Provocative because, of course, it was a platform operated by Western companies, but in international waters, in international airspace. So, there's one kind of provocative action, which is not friendly, but there's another kind of action, which is a direct military threat in terms of the military aircraft crossing into your territory. And I think we have to be very careful about getting the situation right. The second thing, if NATO does set these clear red lines, it's very important that if an incident occurs, for example, a Polish aircraft has to engage a Russian aircraft and shoot it down because of a clear violation, it is very important that the rest of NATO backs this up fully. If you get this kind of situation where NATO does not enforce its own red lines and leaves a country like Poland hanging to dry by not showing solidarity, that would be the end of deterrence vis-a-vis Russia. So that's my view. I think there are situations. Turkey demonstrated, for example, back in 2015 when Turkey shot down a Russian aircraft that violated its airspace. Nothing happened after that. The Russians did not attack Turkey. The message was well received, but the willingness to defend your territory is the crux of NATO, and this has to apply in the air as much as NATO would want it to apply on the ground or at sea.
So basically, NATO country can make that decision independently and does it need to cooperate or coordinate its actions within NATO and other allies?
The right of self-defense, of course, is a national responsibility, yes, and every nation, of course, has the right to, under the UN Charter, under international law, to defend itself if there is a clear aggression, a clear military violation, a clear threat. But, of course, NATO does have an integrated air defense system. And if you look at the case of the drones that crossed into Poland a couple of days ago, or the MiG-31s violating Estonian airspace, you saw Italian F-35s, Dutch F-35s, obviously Polish jets, Danish jets, Swedish jets, all participating in that particular exercise. And afterwards, France sent Rafale jets. The UK has sent some Typhoon jets to Poland to boost our air defense. So air defense is something, yes, which is a national responsibility, but the reaction in terms of integrated radars, early warning, interception, monitoring is done collectively by NATO under its air policing arrangements, which we've seen work well. Allies put their jets in the air, allies responded. The drones were not shot down only by Polish aircraft. So I think that principle of the collective response is at the heart of deterrence, but that's why NATO has very, very clear red lines. So must have clear red lines. So if you have an incident like this, you don't have the UK saying, okay, yes, we'll send our jets into action, and another country saying, no, we're not going to send our jets into action. There has to be an understanding that when certain situations arise, when certain lines are crossed, the alliance will respond collectively. And I think that's deterrence, and that will make Russia stop doing these things in the first place.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in New York for the UN General Assembly and is expected to meet with US President Donald Trump. What are your expectations for this meeting, and afterwards could Trump set up a pressure on Putin?
Well, I think it's very good, of course, that President Zelensky is going to New York for the General Assembly. To be perfectly frank with you, Sofia, Ukraine is not top of the agenda this time, as it's been in the past. We see it's, the recognition of Palestine, the situation in Gaza, of course, dominating the attention, at least over the last couple of days. So I think it's good that Zelensky is there to put Ukraine also on that agenda, because it's the other major international crisis, apart from Gaza, that we are all facing at the moment, including the United States. And I think, not just in his speech at the UN, but in all of the many, many, many bilateral meetings with global leaders that he'll be having, Zelensky can, keep pushing Ukraine's interests forward. And the meeting, of course, with Trump is important. The relations between the two men, thank God, have improved after that terrible meeting in the White House last February. But I think, what Zelensky has to do is communicate two big messages to Trump. Number one, you, Mr. President, and many people in your administration constantly talk about us as if we are losing the war, as if Russia is big, we're small, and therefore, the result is inevitable. That's not true. It's not historically proven that big powers always prevail over smaller powers. Number two, Ukraine is fighting back. Ukraine has captured 160 square kilometers of its territory around Pokrovsk over the last couple of days. Russia is not winning. So please, stop this negative narrative that, all help to us is useless because we're destined to lose. Russia has not won, and that means we have not lost. So I think that would be an important message. The second message is, look, you see that Putin doesn't want peace. We're grateful to you, Mr. President, for your efforts. Thank you. Maybe there'll be an opportunity in the future. But after Alaska, you clearly see that Putin is dead, committed to continue the military aggression and even increase it. So please, support us. lift those restrictions on the use of American systems, speed up your ability to help us with air defense, particularly ahead of the winter, and please, Mr. President, impose better, firmer sanctions on Russia to stop Putin accessing the funds. Trump talks about this all the time, but so far he hasn't done anything, and it's not particularly clear what new sanctions the United States would be willing to impose. The EU is working on a new 19th package of sanctions, which turn the screw importantly in many areas: finance, cryptocurrency, Russian LNG supplies, and so on. But what is the United States intending to do precisely? That's not particularly clear. So I think that this is an important time. You know, Trump always says he's running out of patience with Putin. That's all very well, but when does running out of patience stop and action begin? And I think that's what the President Zelensky, like other European leaders in recent weeks, really now needs to test with President Trump. He's saying the right things, but saying the right things, Sofia, doesn't get you anywhere in life if you don't do the right things.
Talking about the US, how do you assess the American position in terms of this violation of NATO airspace, drones flying over Poland, and etc.? Do you think the reaction of President of the US, Donald Trump, was strong enough?
Well, it's not as strong as I suppose NATO would like it, you know, calling it, saying, you know, well, I don't love it. He said, I don't want it to happen. Nobody wants that thing to happen. You know, bad things can result. Mr. President, which bad things exactly? What are you going to do? But on the other hand, let's be positive, Sofia. His officials, like Mike Waltz, who is just the former national security advisor, who has become the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, he told a meeting of the Security Council on Monday, which was called to discuss the Russian violation of Estonian airspace. You know, he said that the United States was totally committed to the defense of NATO and to Article 5. We see in Congress Republicans and Democrats coming together to agree to impose draconian sanctions on countries that, like India or China, continue to import Russian oil, for example. Although Trump may often be vague, he's now at least making better noises about commitment to NATO and NATO defense. But again, the actions need to follow, and it has to be consistent, because it's no good being resolute on Monday if you're irresolute on Tuesday, and then go back to being resolute for a short period on Wednesday. This of course is not the sort of stuff that impresses Putin. So if Trump now is coming round to recognizing that Putin is an aggressor and is leading him along the primrose path with false promises, that sort of realization, of course, has now got to turn into a different strategy for securing peace in Ukraine, which is peace through strength and peace through denying Russia any kind of victory in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for joining us today in our program and sharing your thoughts about these developments.
Thanks again for the opportunity.